Our first chapter, in which we are introduced to Winnie-the-Pooh and some bees and the stories begin, establishes a lot about the world and the characters themselves. First and foremost, we see that the world building is a shared experience between the author and his audience, Christopher Robin, who is also a key character in the narrative. Christopher Robin frequently interjects the narration with questions or other input, such as this passage where the narrator states, Winnie-the-Pooh lived in a forest all by himself under the name of Sanders. What does under the name mean? Asked Christopher Robin. It means he had the name over the door in gold letters and lived under it. Winnie-the-Pooh wasn't quite sure, said Christopher Robin. Now I am, said a growly voice. And so we see in this passage the child seeking further reason for the world, and the narrator providing it, though the explanation is a delightfully childish one. Moreover, we see how Christopher Robin brings Pooh Bear into the story itself, and it is at this point that we hear Pooh Bear's voice for the first time. This chapter entails Pooh Bear's attempt to get some honey from some nearby bees. The plan involves a certain amount of make-believe, but notice that it's more than simply dressing up in a costume and playing a part. There's a certain transformation that happens, or at least if Christopher Robin would play along, it would. As Pooh Bear covers himself in mud and floats up on a blue balloon, he calls down to Christopher Robin, What do I look like? You look like a bear holding balloon, you said, you being Christopher Robin. Not, said Pooh anxiously, not like a small black cloud in the blue sky. Now you might be thinking, geez, Christopher Robin, don't you have an imagination? Which is fascinating because Christopher Robin is a child and should be able to play along with Pooh Bear here. But in the world of Winnie-the-Pooh, as Carpenter explained, Christopher Robin is the adult and so must perform that kind of role. Apparently, that means not pretending in the same way one might expect a child to do. But pretending in the Pooh books is more than just that. There's an element of transformation as well. When Pooh Bear really gets going in his disguise, the text changes the way in which we refer to him. The bees were still buzzing as suspiciously as ever. Some of them indeed left their nests and flew all around the cloud as it began the second verse of its song. And one bee sat down on the nose of the cloud for a moment and then got up again. Robin, called the cloud. Now this isn't Pooh Bear talking, it's the cloud. I mean, of course it's still Pooh, but the way that the text presents the moment, it's not Pooh pretending to be a cloud, it's Pooh Bear as a cloud. And that's a remarkable slippage of identity here, which we'll get into a little bit more in the second chapter. The end of the chapter brings back the concept of nostalgia we saw in Nodelman's quote. Moreover, it sets up a crucial aspect of the stories. As Christopher Robin and the narrator are wrapping up the chapter, Christopher Robin says, I do remember, and then when I try to remember, I forget. That slippage is important, as the whole chapter is a conversation between Christopher Robin and the narrator. They're not so much simply remembering the moment, they're creating it together. That concept is reinforced a few lines later when Christopher Robin explains, I do remember, only Pooh doesn't so well. That's why he likes having it told to him again, because then it's a real story, and not just remembering. So there's a difference between memory and reality. A difference being that when we remember what we remember happening and what actually happened. A memory, according to Christopher Robin, is fake or not real. But to have the story told again makes it active, a real story. So the construction of these chapters where the narrator is telling Christopher Robin a story, at the same time Christopher Robin is having a hand in creating the story, and that makes them real rather than simply memories, riddled with nostalgia which, according to Nodelman, would obscure that complexity and uncertainty of childhood. So let's keep that complexity and uncertainty in mind as we go through these following chapters. Chapter 2, in which Pooh goes visiting and gets into a tight spot, presents one of my favorite concepts in children's literature, identity. You've probably heard some very famous quotes from Alice in Wonderland that deal with the same thing. When speaking to the caterpillar, Alice says, I know what I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have changed several times since then. And later she notes, it's no use going back to yesterday, because I was a different person then. Identity and discovering, understanding, or creating one's identity is a core concept for children's literature, and we see that play out a lot in this chapter. When Pooh Bear heads out for the day, we get this wonderful little aside. Well, he was humming to himself and walking gaily along, wondering what everyone else was doing and what it felt like being somebody else. This quick, almost throwaway point is so crazy cool. Pooh Bear is exercising not just empathy, but actually playing with the concepts of identity. He's wondering what it's like to be someone else, as we saw with Pooh in the cloud. The end of the chapter also reveals a nifty little meta moment and presents a unique quality of the Pooh texts. As Pooh Bear is stuck in the hole in Rabbit's house, Christopher Robin breaks the news that Pooh Bear isn't going to be able to eat for a while so he can get thin. "I'm afraid no meals," said Christopher Robin, "because of getting thin quicker. But we will read to you." And Pooh Bear responds, "Then would you read a sustaining book, such as would help and comfort a wedged bear in great tightness?" Two things here. First, notice that Pooh Bear is going to have to live off of stories alone, which Christopher Robin will have to read to him. Similarly, Christopher Robin is being read stories by his father, so there's a suggestion that stories have a nourishing quality to them, a little point which I rather like. But the big point here is the style of that Milne is writing in. Notice the capitalization, sustaining book, and wedged bear in great tightness. These are not random choices by Milne or his editors. Remember, capitalized words are proper nouns, meaning their names, identities, and they carry with them a certain significance. Pay attention to what gets capitalized throughout the story, as those are moments of assigning identity and significance to the objects, people, concepts, and such. And it's also a really neat tool that Milne uses throughout the text. Chapter 4, in which Eeyore loses a tail and Pooh finds one, introduces one of my favorite Pooh characters, poor old Eeyore. Now, you've probably seen at some point through Facebook or literally anywhere in the internet in the past year or two, that Pooh Bear and all the characters therein represent various mental disorders, like how Rabbit is OCD and Tigger is ADD. While there may be similarities to these points, that's become a bit of a go-to reading of the Pooh stories, and it's now a bit cliche. So rather than talk about how Eeyore may or may not represent depression, I'm going to touch briefly on what Milne might be doing with a character like this in the 100-Acre Wood. So we meet Eeyore, and right off the bat, he has some big questions. Sometimes, he thought sadly to himself, why? And sometimes thought, wherefore? And sometimes he thought, inasmuch as which? And sometimes he didn't quite know what he was thinking about. These questions are massive, world-forming questions. And if you've ever tried to answer a kid's question, you've probably encountered the torrent of why after every single response. Eeyore's pondering here is representative of a child's curiosity and how it yearns to understand and question, sometimes beyond what a child or an adult for that matter may be able to even handle. Now, we find quickly that Eeyore is missing his tail, and his loss adds to his melancholy. Notice again Milne's use of capitals in Eeyore's response. "That accounts for a great deal," said Eeyore gloomily. "It explains everything. No wonder." Eeyore's reasoning here is an attempt to explain the world. They're Eeyore trying to make sense of his situation, and so he puts them in caps. The fact that his tail has been lost explains everything for Eeyore, and suggests that those big questions he was asking earlier are all connected to this loss. So since Eeyore is one of those child characters, remember that Christopher Robin, Owl, Rabbit, and Kanga are the only real adult figures in the 100-Acre Wood. So this child figure, Eeyore, is grappling with something as huge as loss, and, if we recall Nodelman's quote about nostalgia, loss is what childhood is all about. So Eeyore uniquely represents that idea here in this chapter. And so to fix the problem, Pooh goes to visit Owl, who is a bizarre sort of adult figure and is really fun to break into. What I love about Owl is that he presents as having all of this great knowledge, second only to Christopher Robin, but really, he's all fluff. Let's take a quick look. Christopher Robin was the only one in the forest who could spell, for Owl, wise though he was in many ways, was able to read and write and spell his own name, W-O-L, yet somehow went all to pieces over delicate words like measles and buttered toast. So we get this great setup that Owl is the second smartest person in the forest, and yet he doesn't realize that he can't spell his own name. Soon, we discover that Owl has had Eeyore's tail as his bell pull the whole time without realizing it. And so again, Owl here represents a child's view of an adult. Someone who thinks that they know everything, but somehow, maybe because they think they're so smart, overlooks the most obvious. So let's keep this sort of perspective in mind, as we'll see a little bit more of it in the later chapters. Chapter 6, in which Eeyore has a birthday and gets 2 presents, brings good old Eeyore back, and this time his gloominess is dialed up to 10. It's his birthday, and no one has noticed him. We see that phrase pop up a few times in this chapter, as Eeyore says, "No proper notice taken of me at all." And later, when Pooh Bear says, nobody has taken any notice of Eeyore's birthday. The idea of being unobserved or unseen or simply unnoticed is certainly something a child would struggle with. In a world full of busy adults, it's easy to get lost in the shuffle. A great many children's texts are about this concept, and Milne puts it very plainly here to let a child to say that to let a child go unnoticed may create in the child a sense of unworthiness, or as Eeyore puts it, being pathetic. But Pooh and Piglet are here to save the day. Sort of. Their plan goes selfishly awry, but that's a topic for a larger discussion. Rather, I want to come back to Owl again in this chapter. When Pooh Bear brings Owl the useful pot, he asks Owl to write happy birthday on it. Owl agreed, and just as he was about to write, he turns back to Pooh and says, "Can you read?" Owl asked a little anxiously. And so we soon learn that Owl's anxiety comes from the fact that he's not quite as smart as he puts on, since he turns a happy birthday into hippy peppy bithithdy thesta bithithdy. Nailed it, Owl. Got it in one. So again, we get this strange dissonance that the smartest character, the one who represents the wise adult of the forest other than Christopher Robin, isn't much beyond our bear of very little brain, who, for the record, is much smarter than he gives himself credit for. The gap between adults and children are, perhaps, not quite as massive as adults would like us to think. Yay! Finally, Chapter 7, in which Kanga and Baby Roo come to the forest and Piglet has a bath. I mentioned in the previous videos how this chapter did something really cool with racism, and some of you may have been like, Mr. Yao, I didn't see any racism in this chapter. Ah, yes, gentle student, but did you look deeper? So, think about the animals we have that live in the 100-acre wood. We have a bear, a pig, a rabbit, a donkey, an owl. All of these are standard forest animals and are also native to England. Remember, Tigger doesn't show up until the second book. But now we have Kanga and Roo, who are kangaroos, which are exotic and foreign creatures. Now you can do plenty with the fact that they're animals native to Australia, which had only just begun to break away from British rule in 1901, 25 years before the Pooh stories were written, and they wouldn't become a fully sovereign nation until 1986. But I'm less interested in the nationalist reading. Rather, look at how these exotic and foreign animals are strange animals. Notice again the capitalization, and how that quickly morphs into fierce animals. All of this prejudice is predicated on the fact that Kanga does things differently than Rabbit and the others. So naive prejudice gives way to fear, which gives way to a plan to steal Kanga's baby and blackmail her into leaving the forest. Holy crap! But Milne is creating this scenario to prove a really neat point. With the plan in motion to kidnap Roo, Pooh is the distraction, Piglet the decoy, and Rabbit is the one to swipe the kid. But notice what happens with all of them during the plan. After Rabbit gets Roo and Kanga decides to play along and give Piglet a bath, Pooh stays behind. Milne writes, Pooh, who had decided to be a Kanga, was still at the sandy place at the top of the forest, practicing jumps. Pooh is so fascinated by what Kanga can do, he doesn't just pretend to be Kanga, he decides to be a Kanga and jump around. Now that he's met her, he wants to be her. And Rabbit's in the same boat. Milne writes, Rabbit was playing with Baby Roo in his own house and feeling more fond of him every minute. The characters were all fearful of Kanga and Roo at the beginning simply because they were different. But once they got to know the newcomers, they wanted to emulate and befriend them. In this chapter, racism and xenophobia are born out of a lack of knowledge and experience and is easily remedied by simply getting to know those who are different from you. A lesson that even adults need to hear frequently, especially now. Whew, that was a lot, but no way to shortchange Pooh. Sorry, not sorry. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and I'm happy to continue to speak about it one-on-one if you're interested. Anywho, take care, and I'll see you next time for Peter Pan.